Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. At 3 a.m., the room seems to have changed. It has not. The ceiling is the same distance from the bed it was 3 hours ago. The same plaster, the same faint seam, where two sections met during construction, and the line has slowly widened over the building's years of expansion and contraction. The walls are where they were. The window is where it was. The curtain holds the fold it has held all night, weighted at the hem, the lower edge resting against the sill, the upper edge admitting a narrow gap through which a thin line of illumination enters from the street below. The objects in the room have not moved. The glass of water on the surface beside the bed is where it was placed before sleep. The door is at the same angle it was before sleep. The shelf holds what the last waking hour left on it. The dimensions of the room are the same dimensions they were when sleep arrived. Nothing has been added. Nothing has been removed. The room is identical to the room that was here at midnight. What has changed is not in the room. The body has been losing heat since sleep onset. The internal temperature follows a cycle it runs every night, with or without awareness, with or without sleep, rising through the afternoon into the early evening, falling as the night deepens, reaching its lowest value in the hours before the first light of morning. At this hour, the body is at or near that lowest point, a fraction of a degree cooler than at midnight, a fraction of a degree cooler than when sleep first arrived. The number is not large. It is present in the tissue, in the metabolic rate, in the rate at which the heart contracts and the lungs exchange gas, present throughout the whole body, running as a fact of where the nightly cycle currently sits. This position in the cycle changes what the body can receive from the room. The bedding holds the record of the night's movement. In the regions where the body has rested through the hours since sleep, the long line where the back has been, the curve where the knees drew up at some point in the night, the area where the feet have spent most of the hours. The fabric holds warmth, not warmth from now, warmth placed there across the night, the body releasing heat at the rate the gradient between skin and fabric allowed, the material absorbing what it received and holding it. In the regions the body has not occupied, the far side of the mattress, the section of pillow that has not been under the head, the temperature is closer to the room's ambient air. The distribution of warmth in the bedding is the record of where the body has been. At the boundary between the skin and the air, exchange continues. Where the body is covered, the exchange is slow. The fabric has reached near skin temperature. The gradient between skin and bedding is small. Very little passes in either direction. Where the face is uncovered, the exchange runs faster. The air immediately over the face receives what the skin surface there releases. This air, slightly warmed by the exchange, rises by convection and is replaced by cooler air from the room, and the exchange begins again. The skin of the face is in continuous contact with the room's air, losing to it at the rate the current difference between the body's surface temperature and the room temperature allows. The face is slightly cooler at this hour than it was at sleep onset, not uncomfortably. The body's surface temperature and the room's air temperature are not far apart at this hour. The room has been holding the warmth that the body has released all night, and the body is near its nadir of production, and the two conditions have approached each other across the hours of darkness. But the exchange is still running, still net in one direction. The air near the bed holds what the body has given it, slightly warmer than the air at the far end of the room, slightly heavier with the moisture that the skin and the breathing have released. On the surface beside the bed, the glass of water has reached the temperature of the room. It was set down warmer than the air, not by much, but by the amount that tap water sits above the ambient when it is first poured. Since then, heat has moved from the water through the glass walls of the container and into the surrounding air, and the water's temperature has fallen toward the air temperature of the room. It has now been there long enough that the exchange is nearly complete. The water is the temperature of the room. At the surface of the water, exchange continues in both directions. Molecules leave the water surface and enter the air above it as vapor, at the rate the temperature and the dryness of that small column of air permit. Molecules from the air occasionally arrive at the water surface and join the liquid. The two rates are nearly balanced at this hour. The air in the vicinity of the glass is slightly more humid than the rest of the room, from the outward exchange running across the night. The meniscus holds its curve at the glass wall, the surface tension unchanged, the shape determined by the same forces it was determined by when the glass was first filled. The glass of water is doing what glass-held water does. The room contains sounds. They were there at midnight. The refrigerator in the adjacent space runs on a cycle, the compressor engaging when the interior temperature rises above its threshold, running until the temperature falls, disengaging, the interior rising again until the compressor is needed once more. The compressor produces vibration at low frequencies, below the range where the ear is most sensitive, and this vibration travels through the machine's housing into the floor and into the wall separating the rooms, and arrives here as a slight change in the pressure of the air. Not a sound in the sense of something with a distinct onset and a name. A quality of the air, a texture to the atmosphere of the room that is different when the compressor is running from when it is not. This vibration was present at midnight. The pipes in the walls have been cooling since the last use of hot water. The water that remains in them has been giving up its heat to the pipe walls, and the walls have been giving their heat to the surrounding building material, and the material is releasing what the day left in it. Thermal contraction moves through the pipe material as it cools, not uniformly, not all at once, but zone by zone as the temperature gradient advances through the metal. When the contraction in a section of pipe creates sufficient stress against the fitting that holds it, the fitting yields by a fraction, and the yield is brief and specific. A small sound, not immediately repeated, different each time in pitch and duration, because the exact geometry of the contact changes with each adjustment. This was happening at midnight. Beyond the window, the street carries what a street at this hour carries, reduced but not absent. A vehicle at distance, its engine sound arriving through the glass at the frequencies the glass transmits, entering the room. If there are trees between the window and the street, the occasional movement of a leaf in air that is mostly still. The ambient sound of a city at 3 a.m. is not silence. It is a specific level of sound, lower than what the day provides, present at this level every night at this hour, consistent enough that it registered as background at midnight and was not attended to. At midnight, the compressor vibration was below the line. The pipe adjustment was below the line. The vehicle passing outside was below the line. What has changed at this hour is not the sounds. What has changed is the position of the line. During sleep, the threshold at which a sound produces a response in the system shifts outward, not stopping. The structures that convert sound into neural signal continue working. The pathway toward the brain continues carrying what they produce. But the threshold at which arriving signal becomes a change in the system state moves further from the signal strength. Familiar sounds fall below the line. The refrigerator, which at waking levels would sit very close to the boundary of audibility, falls well below it. The pipe's small adjustment, which at waking levels would be a small but distinct event, falls below it. At this hour, the system has moved closer to wakefulness, not into wakefulness, not into the state where language begins, where the day's concerns present themselves in sequence, but closer. The threshold has moved inward, toward what the room is offering. The refrigerator vibration, at the same frequency and amplitude it held at midnight, now sits at a level that crosses the line. The pipe makes its small adjustment, and the sound arrives. The vehicle outside is a vehicle, briefly, before the room resumes. The room is not louder. The room is producing the same sounds it was producing at midnight. The threshold has moved toward them. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. Against the curtain, a narrow band of light enters at the upper edge. The source is outside and below the window's framing. A street light, the ambient illumination of this hour, arriving at the window glass at a shallow angle and passing through the gap in the curtain in the small quantity the gap's geometry allows. A few photons per second, or several hundred. The number measurable, small by any daylight scale. The gap has not changed since the curtain was drawn. The source has not changed. The angle of arrival has shifted slightly as the hours have advanced and the planet has turned, but the change in the number of photons crossing the gap between midnight and this hour is not significant. This light was entering the room at midnight. The wall it falls on was receiving it then. The ceiling near the curtain was lit to the same degree by it then. At midnight, the room felt dark. At this hour, the line on the wall is visible. The ceiling above the curtain gap is not quite dark. The eye has been in darkness for the duration of sleep. In the absence of light, the photosensitive layer of the retina restores what light had depleted. The compound at the center of low light vision. The pigment that photons break down. The breakdown being the event that initiates the signal sent toward the brain, is rebuilt, molecule by molecule in darkness. In sustained darkness, the concentration of this compound climbs back toward its maximum. After 20 minutes of darkness, the eye's sensitivity to light is substantially greater than it was in ordinary room illumination. After an hour, greater still. After several hours, the hours of sleep, the eye has reached or closely approached the maximum sensitivity its cellular structure allows. At this level of dark adaptation, the eye requires almost nothing to register. A handful of photons, a level of illumination that in daylight would not move the signal at all. The narrow band of light entering through the curtain gap, the same light that was there at midnight, carrying the same number of photons, falling on the same wall, is, at this hour, above the threshold the dark adapted eye requires to register it. At midnight, it was below that threshold. The room was offering the same illumination it is offering now. The eye required more than the room was providing. At this hour, the eye requires almost nothing from the room, and the room is providing enough. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The room did not become more awake. The threshold had moved closer to the surface. What the refrigerator's vibration requires to be heard, what the narrow band of light through the curtain requires to register, what the pipe's small adjustment requires to become a sound. These are positions on a continuum, and the body's location in its nightly cycle determines where on that continuum the thresholds currently sit. As the body moves from the deepest hours of sleep toward the pre-dawn chemistry of approach, the thresholds move with it, not suddenly. Gradually, along the curve the cycle traces, the receiving end of each channel moving toward what the room has been offering all night. The room has been offering the same things all night. The threshold arrived at a different position. Hours before the intended waking time, the body begins a preparation it does not announce. A compound released by the adrenal glands increases slowly in concentration in the blood. The increase is not a spike. It is a gradual rise, building through the pre-dawn hours toward the levels that accompany the first moments of the waking day. The schedule for this rise was not set tonight. It was established across many nights, from the accumulated record of when light began, when demands arrived, when the chemistry of waking was needed. The body has encoded this record into the timing of its chemistry. The compound is rising now because the timing says this is when it rises. Hours before any alarm, hours before any exterior signal calls for waking. The heart rate, which reached its minimum in the deepest hours of sleep, has begun to return. Not dramatically, a few beats per minute above the lowest value the night produced. The cardiac muscle has slightly more tone. The blood is moving at a slightly higher rate through the circuit of the body. The vessels in the extremities, which in the deep hours reduced their flow to the minimum the tissue requires, are receiving slightly more. The hands are slightly warmer than they were at the nadir. The feet are slightly warmer. The breathing has shifted upward from the rate the deepest sleep held. Still well below waking. Still the slow exchange of a body in which the most demanding processing has not yet resumed. but the rate has moved. The depth of each breath has changed. The balance between the drive to breathe and the rate at which the blood chemistry calls for it has shifted, moved by the rising compound, by the returning heart rate, by the body's slow movement toward the conditions from which waking will come. The body is not awake. The body is in the pre-dawn chemistry of approach. It is moving toward waking from the inside at its own rate, following the schedule it assembled without asking. The ceiling receives all of this. The plaster holds its temperature at the rate plaster holds temperature in a room at this hour. The narrow line of light from the curtain's gap travels across the room, reaches the ceiling at the angle the room's geometry produces, and arrives. The ceiling does not know that the threshold below it has moved, that the same refrigerator vibration that was below the line at midnight is now just above it, that the photons from the gap in the curtain are now registering where they were not registering 3 hours ago. The ceiling reflects sound at the angles the surface determines. It holds heat at the rate plaster holds heat. The room continues. The glass of water beside the bed holds the temperature of the room. The exchange at its surface is still running. Molecules leaving the water for the air, molecules arriving from the air into the water, the two rates nearly matched, the net movement very slow. The meniscus holds its curve at the glass wall. The water that was poured last night is the water that is here now, minus the fraction the surface has released across the hours of darkness, plus the fraction the room's air has returned. The return is not the same water. The exchange continues. The compound in the blood continues its slow rise toward the concentration the waking hour requires. The dark adapted eye continues to receive the room's minimal light at a threshold that costs it almost nothing. The sounds that sat below the register at midnight are above it now, arriving as the threshold that separates them from the register continues its inward movement toward what the room has been offering all night, toward the hour the body has already decided is next. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. The room is present. The ceiling is at its distance above the bed. The sounds of the room are audible. Whatever the building carries at this hour, whatever moves through the pipes, whatever the street sends through the glass, the light through the gap in the curtain is there. The air against the face is the temperature it has been for hours. The weight of the bedding is on the body. The body is lying in the bed. The body is not moving, not yet. What is happening in the body is not damage. It is not a failure of the body to respond. It is not a threshold the body has crossed into something it cannot cross back from. What is happening is the continuation of a state the body enters every night during sleep, a state that is correct, that is required by the architecture of the sleep cycle, that has been running throughout the most active phase of the night's processing and that has not yet completed its scheduled withdrawal. The body is in a state it entered normally. It has not yet exited that state normally. This state runs 4 or 5 times each night. The sleep cycle moves through several phases, and the most active phase, the phase in which the brain runs closest to its waking levels, returns in cycles throughout the night. Each cycle, the body enters the suppression state. Each cycle, it exits. The cycles in the later hours of the night are longer than the cycles in the earlier hours. The first cycle of the night produces a brief period of high brain activity. The last cycle before waking can sustain that activity for close to an hour. Most nights, the body enters and exits the suppression state without any interval between consciousness returning and motor function resuming. The exit is clean. The sequence completes in the right order. Tonight, the sequence did not complete in the right order. Consciousness returned first. The suppression was still running. The room became present, audible, visible, spatially located, before the motor system was available to act on the room's information. The gap between the two is usually imperceptible. Tonight it is not. Every night, during the phase of sleep in which the brain's activity most closely resembles waking, the motor system of the body is suppressed. The reason is simple in its logic. The brain, during this phase, generates motor commands. The motor cortex, the region that in waking life produces the commands that travel down the spinal cord to the muscles, is active. It is producing the signals that would, in waking, produce movement. If those signals reached the muscles without interruption, the body would move. It would act out whatever the brain is processing. It would run, or reach, or speak, or fall. The body in the bed would move without intent, without direction, without the waking context that gives movement meaning. The suppression prevents this. A separate mechanism, running in parallel with the dream, sends inhibitory signals to the motor neurons, the cells in the spinal cord, whose activity drives the muscles directly. The inhibitory signal is chemical. It arrives at the motor neurons and changes the state of their surface, holding each cell farther from the threshold at which it would fire. The motor neuron receives the command from the motor cortex above. It also receives the inhibitory signal from below. The inhibitory signal is sufficient. The motor neuron does not reach the threshold. The signal does not continue to the muscle. The muscle does not contract. Compounds such as glycine and GABA carry this inhibition. The body lies still because the correct mechanism is working. The dreaming brain generates motor commands, and the motor commands are intercepted before they reach the muscles, and the body does not enact the dream. This has been happening throughout the dream phase. The hands have not moved. The legs have not moved. The face has not moved, or has moved only in the small ways that the suppression allows at its edges, where the inhibition is less complete. The body in the bed has been in this state for the duration of the dream phase, and the dream phase has been running at the brain's most active level, and the suppression has been running at its most complete level, and none of this was visible. It became visible when consciousness returned before the suppression withdrew. The transition from the dream phase toward waking is a transition across systems, and the systems do not all transition at the same rate. Some systems return to their waking state before others. The auditory system, the pathway that processes the room's sounds and delivers them as events that can be located and distinguished, begins its return toward full waking sensitivity early in the transition. The visual system, the pathways that process light arriving at the retina and construct the visible layout of the room, follows a similar curve. The system that tracks the position and weight of the body, the proprioceptive input from the joints and muscles and skin, returns. The system that processes the temperature of the air at the face returns. These systems are close to their waking function. The inhibitory mechanism on the motor neurons is still running. Consciousness has returned. The room is audible and visible. The ceiling is at its distance. The air against the face has its temperature and its slight movement from the exchange with the skin. The weight of the bedding registers at the points where it contacts the body. The sounds that have been present in the room all night, the building's small adjustments, whatever travels through the pipes, the ambient sound of the street, arrive and are processed as distinct events in specific locations. The room is fully present. The body cannot move. The commands generated by the motor cortex, if the motor cortex is generating them, if the intention to move is there, are still being intercepted. The motor neurons are still receiving the inhibitory binding that was running during the dream phase. The binding has not yet cleared. The gap between the room being present and the body being able to respond to the room is the gap between the rate at which consciousness returned and the rate at which the inhibitory mechanism is completing its withdrawal. There is one part of the motor system that is running. The muscles that move the eyes are controlled by separate pathways. Cranial nerves that originate in the brainstem at locations where the distribution of the dream phase inhibition is different from its distribution in the spinal cord. These nerves connect to the 6 muscles that rotate each eye within its socket. During the dream phase, these muscles move, producing the rapid scanning movements that track whatever the dreaming brain presents. The inhibitory map does not suppress them to the same degree that it suppresses the limb muscles. In the interval of paralysis, the eyes can often still move while the limbs cannot. The room can be tracked. The ceiling, the walls, the gap in the curtain, the surface beside the bed. The eyes move to them, and the visual information arrives and is processed. The hand does not move to follow the eyes. The head does not turn. The limbs remain in the position the dream phase left them. But the eyes are at their waking availability, or close to it, running under the part of the inhibitory map that did not reach them with the same completeness it reached the spinal motor neurons. The inhibitory map across the motor system is not uniform. The sensation of pressure at the chest is a consequence of the same suppression, not an addition to it. The muscles that produce normal breathing include 2 kinds. The diaphragm, the large dome of muscle below the lungs, controlled by nerve pathways that originate at a different level of the spinal cord from the limb muscles and receiving less complete inhibitory coverage during the dream phase. continues to contract and relax. Breathing continues throughout the dream phase and through the interval of paralysis because the diaphragm is allowed to run. Without the diaphragm, breathing would stop. The architecture of the suppression allows it to continue. The muscles of the chest wall, the intercostals that lift the ribs outward and upward during waking inhalation, expanding the chest cavity and creating the pressure reduction that draws air into the lungs, receive more complete suppression during the dream phase. They are part of the same inhibitory map that holds the limbs. The same holding signal reaches them. They are not firing. The chest does not expand in the waking way. The diaphragm descends and air enters the lungs through the reduced negative pressure this creates, working harder to move the same volume of air because the chest cavity is not expanding to assist it. Breathing is occurring. The air exchange is continuing, but the contribution of the rib expansion that waking breathing includes is absent, and the work of the diaphragm is slightly greater in its absence, and the airway opens against a chest wall that is flat and held rather than actively participating. The sensation this produces, the pressure, the weight of the sternum, the breath that feels narrower than usual, is the physical output of a normal inhibitory distribution. The mechanism that is suppressing the intercostals is the same mechanism that is suppressing the limb muscles. It is working correctly. It is producing this sensation as a side effect of its correct operation. The pressure is the suppression, still running. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The body had not failed to move. It had not yet been released. The inhibitory signal that is preventing the motor neurons from firing is a signal that has a scheduled end. It was set to run for the duration of the dream phase. The dream phase has ended. The brain has begun its transition toward waking. The most active processing is concluding. The neural activity that characterizes the dream phase is reducing. The inhibitory mechanism, which ran correctly throughout that phase, is now in the process of withdrawing. The withdrawal takes an interval. In most cases, the interval is a matter of seconds from the point at which consciousness returns to the point at which the motor system is released. Sometimes the interval is longer, a minute or several minutes. The duration is not a measure of how severe the condition is or how far outside of normal it lies. It is the duration of the remaining gap between the rate at which the conscious systems completed their transition and the rate at which the inhibitory mechanism completes its own. The two processes, returning consciousness and withdrawing inhibition, usually synchronize without any perceptible gap. When they do not synchronize, the interval between them is what is being experienced. The gap is not pathological. It is the seam between two processes that usually meet without showing the seam. The body is in that gap. The room is present. The body is in the bed. The weight of the body is distributed across the mattress at the contact point it reached at the end of the dream phase. The back, the heels, the shoulder blades, wherever the body settled into the position it has held through the dream. The bedding presses at those points with the pressure that the weight and the softness of the material produce. The face receives the air at its current temperature. The sounds in the room arrive and are processed. None of this is different from waking, except that the signals going outward, the commands from the motor cortex toward the muscles, the intention to shift the weight, to lift the hand, to move the jaw, are not reaching their destinations. The inhibitory signal that is holding the motor neurons below their threshold is withdrawing at the rate the neural chemistry of the withdrawal allows. The motor neurons are approaching the state in which an incoming command will be sufficient to cross them. The body is approaching its release. When the release comes, the first movement is usually small, not the full resumption of waking motion, not the arms lifting, the body turning, the full range of voluntary movement returning simultaneously. A small first event, a finger shifting, the jaw moving slightly, the neck rotating by a small amount. The motor pathway from the motor cortex to a specific muscle closes. The command travels down the spinal cord to the motor neuron, which is now above the threshold for firing. The motor neuron fires. The signal travels along the nerve to the neuromuscular junction. The fiber contracts. The joint moves. The movement occurs. The interval ends there or close to there. This first movement does something specific. When the muscle contracts and the joint moves, the proprioceptive sensors in the muscle spindles and in the joint capsule, sensors that register the tension and position and rate of change of the tissue, send signals back toward the brain. The sensory motor loop that normal waking movement involves. Command goes down, muscle moves, position signal returns, confirming the movement. This loop was not running during the paralysis interval. The commands were being blocked. No movement was occurring. No position signal was returning. The sensory side of the motor system was receiving nothing from the body that confirmed the body had moved. Because the body had not moved, the loop was open. When the first movement occurs, the loop closes. The brain receives confirmation that the motor system is now responsive. The proprioceptive signal returns. The circuit that was open for the duration of the interval closes, and the subsequent release of the remaining inhibition, the inhibitory signals still holding the other motor neurons, often follows more quickly once the first movement has demonstrated that the pathway is working. The limbs become available. The chest expands in the waking way. The intercostals resume their contribution to the breath. The rib cage lifting outward. The chest cavity opening to the full volume the waking breath requires. The weight that was pressing against the sternum is no longer pressing. Not because anything has been removed, but because the muscles that expand the chest are no longer held below the threshold at which they would respond. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The room is still the same room. The ceiling is at its distance. The sounds that were audible through the interval are still audible. The building at this hour, the street at this distance, whatever the pipes carry. The light through the curtain gap is still there. The body is in the bed, now able to move, or in the first moments of being able to move, or still in the last seconds of the interval approaching its end. The mechanism that produced the paralysis was not a malfunction. It was the correct suppression of the motor system during the phase in which the brain most required it. It ran for the duration of the dream phase. It began its withdrawal when the dream phase ended. It is completing its withdrawal now, or has completed it, at the rate the neural chemistry of the transition allowed. The architecture that produced the interval is the same architecture that produces ordinary sleep every night without producing any interval at all. The same mechanism, the same chemistry, the same withdrawal sequence, running at a slightly different rate of synchronization between its components. The same architecture runs every night. Most nights, the seam does not show. Tonight it showed. In the brainstem and spinal cord, the last holding signals continue to withdraw. The motor neurons return toward the state in which a command can cross them. The seam that opened between the two processes, consciousness returning, suppression continuing, is closing at the rate the withdrawal allows. The body that had not failed to move is almost on the other side of the interval, the ceiling at its distance, the breath expanding the chest the full way. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. The phone is the only light in the room. The ceiling is dark. The walls are dark. The objects in the room are present as shapes and masses. The geometry held, the surface invisible. The window passes what the street outside sends through the glass. A thin line of ambient illumination that in full dark adaptation would register at the threshold of visibility. In the presence of the screen, it registers as nothing. The screen has overwritten it. The screen is not bright in any absolute sense. Not bright like the room's overhead light. Not bright like daylight. Not bright like anything that would cause discomfort in the waking eye. But relative to the dark room it occupies, the screen is the dominant source. Everything that is lit in this room is lit by it. The hands holding the phone, the undersides of the wrists, the surface of the chest that the phone is held above, the ceiling receiving the small fraction of the screen's output that travels upward past the face. In a dark room at this hour, a phone screen is a lamp, a small one, the room's only one. The room has been dark for longer than the phone has been on. Before the phone came on, the room was in the state a room reaches after the lights have been off for some time. The large sources of illumination absent, the only light the ambient trickle from the street, the eye dark adapting toward the maximum sensitivity the cellular structure of the retina allows. In that state, full dark adaptation, the room's geometry was visible. The outline of the window, the edges of the furniture, the shapes of objects on the shelf. The phone screen ended that. The screen is bright enough, even at reduced brightness settings, even at the levels a night mode or low brightness setting produces, to partially reverse the dark adaptation the eye had achieved. The photosensitive pigment in the retinal cells that had been regenerating in the absence of light begins to bleach under the screen's output. the eye's sensitivity to the room's ambient light drops. The room outside the screen's illumination becomes darker. The street's contribution through the window, which was visible before the screen came on, is now invisible. Not because less light is coming from the street, but because the eye is now calibrated to the screen's brightness, and the street's contribution falls below that calibrated threshold. The screen has made the room around it darker. The screen produces light at the pixel level. Each small region, each pixel, operates independently. Some regions are at or near their maximum output. Some are at intermediate levels. Some, in the display technology most phones now use, are fully off, producing no light at all when the content calls for dark. The pattern of bright and dim and absent across the surface of the screen is the image. It is not printed on the glass. It is generated by the hardware at the rate the content changes, or at the rate the gesture changes which portion of the content is currently visible. At this moment, the screen shows a particular arrangement of light. A fraction of a second ago, it showed a different arrangement. A fraction of a second before that, a different one again. These arrangements succeed each other at a rate the eye cannot resolve as individual frames, fast enough that the transitions appear as motion, as continuous visual flow, rather than as the sequence of discrete states they are. The image appears to scroll. Content appears to rise from below and pass out of the frame above. What the eye tracks as movement is the result of each successive arrangement being shifted slightly upward relative to the previous one. Each frame showing the same content but repositioned, so that what was in the center of the screen is now at the top, and what was below the visible area is now at the center. The content is not moving. The pattern of light is shifting across the surface. The eye receives these shifts as motion. The visual system, which evolved to track objects moving through space, which is highly sensitive to motion and change in the visual field, responds to the shifting pattern with the same machinery it would use if something were actually moving. Small, rapid eye movements adjust the point of fixation as each new arrangement appears. The attentional system assigns salience to the elements of each new arrangement. The image in the upper portion, the text, the signal from the color that indicates an unread notification. Each new arrangement is evaluated at a speed determined by the visual system's current state. At this hour, the visual system is continuing to do this. It has been doing it for the duration of the session. The muscles that control the eye's position, the 6 muscles around each eye, coordinated to produce precise fixation and tracking movements, have been operating continuously. The visual cortex has been processing each new arrangement at the rate the shifts provide it. The attentional system has been assigning and reassigning salience. None of this processing is different from the processing that occurs during the day when the same actions are performed. The hour does not change the processing. It changes only what else the body would otherwise be doing at this hour. The glass that carries this light has not changed. It is the same piece of glass it was an hour ago, the same it was when the phone was first picked up. It is thin, a few millimeters, and it has been chemically treated to be stronger than untreated glass of the same thickness. The outer surface compressed by the exchange of smaller sodium ions for larger potassium ions during the strengthening process. The surface held under residual compressive stress that makes it more resistant to fracture. The surface that results from this treatment is very smooth, not merely polished, but planarized to tolerances at the nanometer scale. The surface irregularities that cutting and ordinary polishing would leave removed or reduced to below the scale at which they affect the passage of light. Running a finger across this surface encounters very little resistance. The ridges of the fingerprint make contact at their peaks. The valleys of the fingerprint do not touch the glass. The actual contact area, the area where skin is in physical contact with glass, is a fraction of the apparent contact area, a pattern of small patches corresponding to the pattern of the fingerprint ridges, each patch a few microns across. At each patch, the temperature of the glass surface is slightly elevated by the contact with the warmer finger. The swipe is not mechanical. The glass does not move. The content does not move. What the swipe does is change the electrical state of a sensor grid embedded within the glass assembly, a transparent grid of conductive material that detects changes in the local electrostatic field when a conductor approaches. The finger, which is conductive, changes the field at the point of proximity. The sensors register the change. The electronics process the position and direction of the gesture, and the application responds by shifting the displayed content in the direction the gesture indicated. The light pattern changes. The glass passes the new pattern. The new pattern reaches the eye. The glass surface after the swipe is the same surface. Only what it is showing has changed. The content being displayed has a structural end. The feed is not a continuous stream. It is a sequence of batches, discrete groups of items requested from a remote server and loaded into the application's memory. The first batch was loaded when the session began. As the scroll position approached the end of that batch, the application sent a request to the server for additional content. The server processed the request and returned the next batch. The items in that batch were appended below the items already loaded. The apparent end of the feed, the point at which the user would reach a boundary, would see a bottom, would reach the end of the available surface, was extended before it was reached. When the scroll position approaches the new end, the request runs again. The timing of this request is set so that the new content arrives before the current scroll position reaches the end of the currently loaded content. The user does not see the boundary. The feed appears continuous because the mechanism extends the surface at the rate the approach to the end is detected. Not because there is no end to the content. The database of available content is large, not infinite, and the algorithm that selects which items to serve has finite inputs. The identifiers associated with the account, the engagement signals collected from previous sessions, the content available from the accounts and sources the platform system has associated with this one. From these inputs, the algorithm produces a ranked list. Items from this list are served in batches. When one batch is near exhaustion, the next batch is drawn from the list and delivered. The list is not bottomless. but the mechanism does not reach the bottom of the list before the session ends. The session ends before that, and when the session ends, the list, updated by what this session contributed to the engagement signals, is ready to produce a new ranked output for the next session. The content changes. The mechanism persists. The experience of scrolling without end is the experience of a mechanism that generates new surface at the rate the approach to the end is detected. The page did not continue because it had meaning. It continued because another surface was always possible. The mechanism that generates the new surface does not evaluate what the surface carries. It does not distinguish between content that produces strong engagement and content that produces none. It monitors the scroll position. When the position satisfies the condition, when the distance to the end of the loaded content falls below a threshold, it sends the request and appends the response. The content of the response does not determine whether the response is sent. The position determines it. The feed extends. Whether what it currently shows is being attended to closely, or being held in partial attention, or passing across the eye without resolution. Whether the content is landing as information or as a surface the eye moves across without finding a stopping point. None of this changes when the next surface arrives. The mechanism that extends the surface does not observe the quality of the attention the current surface is receiving. It observes the position. Position is what it can measure. Position is what triggers the load. The surface extends because the mechanism extends it. The device in the hands has been processing for the duration of the session. The chip that handles the application's logic, the rendering of images, the management of network requests, the execution of the code that monitors scroll position and triggers content loading, generates heat as a byproduct of its operation. Heat is the waste output of computation. Energy that entered the chip as electrical current was partially converted into computation and was partially released as thermal motion in the chip's substrate. This heat conducts outward through the layers of material between the chip and the device's outer surfaces. The back of the device, where the housing is in contact with the palm, is warmer than it was when the session began. The edges of the device, where the housing meets the glass, carry the warmth outward to the frame around the screen. The hands holding the device are warmer on the surfaces in contact with the device than on the surfaces not in contact. The body has been holding the device above itself for the duration of the session. The arms are extended, the phone supported at some distance above the chest. The weight of the device, distributed between the two hands, somewhere close to 160 or 180 grams depending on the model, a weight that in any other context would be too small to notice, is held against gravity by the sustained low-level contraction of the muscles of the forearms, wrists, and hands. Not demanding, not the kind of holding that produces awareness of effort, but sustained. The muscles maintaining the position at the fraction of their capacity that is sufficient, the tendons transmitting the force, the joints at the wrists and knuckles under the small load that 170 grams in this position produces, The neck is at the angle the screen requires. The body is in the position of sleep, horizontal, supported, the weight distributed across the bed surface. The visual system is not in the position of sleep. It is running at the rate it runs during waking. The eye muscles tracking, the visual cortex processing each successive arrangement of light, the attentional system assigning and reassigning salience at the speed the content arrives. The thumb, which is the body part closest to the screen surface, has performed the same motion many times during the session. The small lateral movement that registers as a swipe, that shifts the content upward, that triggers the mechanism. The thumb moves, the surface changes. The thumb is ready to move again. The screen illuminates the face from below, the chin catching most of the light, the lower cheeks, the underside of the nose, the lower lid of each eye. The forehead and the upper portions of the face are in relative shadow. This is the reversal of ordinary illumination. In most waking situations, light arrives from above, from the sun, from ceiling fixtures, and the face receives it from above, the shadows falling downward. The phone held above the chest and tilted toward the face delivers light from below the normal angle. The shadows it produces run upward. The features of the face are readable but oddly weighted. The jaw prominent in the light, the upper face darker. The ceiling above the bed carries, very faintly, whatever the screen is currently displaying. The light that travels upward from the screen past the face continues to the ceiling and arrives there enlarged and softened. The image that the phone is displaying, projected at low intensity onto the plaster, the colors present but muted, the shapes of the content visible in the ceiling surface if the room were otherwise lit enough to see them. In the dark room, the ceiling's reflection of the screen is the only surface in the room that carries the content other than the screen itself. It holds each pattern for the fraction of a second the screen shows it, then holds the next. The room is receiving all of this. The glass at room temperature, or slightly above it at the edges where the screen's operating heat has warmed the housing. The smooth surface passing the current pattern of light upward toward the face. The ceiling receiving the fraction of the screen's output that travels past the face and arrives there, faintly carrying the current content in low-intensity reflection. The arms extended in the sustained low-level holding. The forearm muscles maintaining their small continuous output. The wrists in the position the holding requires. The fingertip contact against the glass warming the surface at the contact points. The dark room around all of this, darker than it would be without the screen. The screen having calibrated the eye away from the room's ambient illumination. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The feed is at some position in the current loaded batch. The mechanism monitoring the scroll position is running at the rate the application's update cycle allows, checking the position against the threshold many times each second, comparing the current scroll depth against the end of the loaded content, finding the distance still above the threshold at which the next request will be sent. The next batch is not yet requested. It will be requested when the position reaches the threshold. The threshold will be reached when the scrolling continues far enough. The bottom of the feed is ahead of where the scrolling has reached. The bottom moves before the scrolling arrives. The screen remains the only lamp in the room. On the ceiling, the next pattern has already changed. The thumb remains above the glass. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. At midnight, the room is dark. Not absolutely. The street outside contributes its ambient illumination through the curtain gap, and the various small indicator lights on the devices in the room produce their constant points of red and green and white, but dark enough that the eye, given time, would adjust toward the state of maximum sensitivity, the dark adapted state, the state the retina reaches after roughly 20 minutes of low illumination, when the photosensitive pigments have had the chance to regenerate and the cells responsible for low light vision are running at their highest gain. The screen is producing light, not a large amount in absolute terms. A phone screen at reduced brightness produces perhaps 30 or 40 lumens, less than a single candle, far less than the overhead light that was on earlier in the evening. In a room during the day, this level of output would not be noticeable against the ambient illumination. The room around the screen is still dark. The ceiling is still dark. The walls beyond the screen's immediate illumination are still dark. But the screen, which the eye is looking at directly, is producing photons at the surface the eye is pointed toward, and those photons are entering the eye, and the eye is not completing its dark adaptation. The light from the screen illuminates the face from below or from one side. The underside of the chin receives most of it, the lower cheeks, the surface of the hands holding the device. This is not the direction from which light usually arrives. Daylight and most artificial light comes from above, from the ceiling, from fixtures overhead. The screen reverses this. The shadow it produces runs upward. The face that the room's darkness surrounds is lit from below by a source smaller than a paperback book, and the light from this source is the only illumination that is currently active in the room. The ceiling, faintly, carries whatever the screen is showing. The colors present at low intensity, the shape of the image visible if the room were bright enough to read them. The dark adaptation that would otherwise occur is not occurring. The screen is producing light at the surface the eye is looking at. The process of rebuilding toward maximum sensitivity in darkness requires darkness. The screen provides the opposite. Continuous photon delivery at the surface closest to the eye. The cells that dark adapt are cells that respond to light by changing their chemical state, bleaching in the presence of light, restoring in its absence. At the rate the screen is producing photons, the restoring is slower than the bleaching. The eye is at a midpoint. more sensitive than in full room illumination, less sensitive than it would be after an hour of complete darkness. This has a visible consequence. The room around the screen is darker than it would appear to an eye that had been in complete darkness for an hour. Not because the room is absolutely dark, because the eye is calibrated to the screen's output and the ambient illumination of the room, the street's contribution through the curtain gap, the faint surfaces of the walls, falls below the threshold that calibration establishes. The screen produces photons across a range of wavelengths. The combination of colors that makes the image appear white or normally colored requires emitters that cover the visible spectrum. To achieve this, the screen uses components that produce short wavelength light in the range of roughly 420 to 490 nanometers, the portion of the visible spectrum that corresponds to the colors blue and blue-violet. This portion of the output is not incidental. It is required to produce the white and near-white colors that dominate most screens displaying text, backgrounds, and general interface elements. The screen emitting what appears to be a neutral, slightly cool white light is emitting substantially in this range. The photons in this range have a specific property that distinguishes them from photons at other visible wavelengths, not in the quality of the light they produce for vision. At normal illumination levels, the eye does not perceive blue light as different in kind from light at other wavelengths. The image on the screen looks white, or slightly warm, or slightly cool, depending on the screen's color settings. The blue-green component is not visible as blue-green. It is absorbed into the appearance of a normally colored image. But the energy at these wavelengths is present in the photon stream, and it is present at the specific frequencies that match the sensitivity of a set of cells in the retina that are not involved in seeing the image. These cells evolved in a world where blue-green light at this intensity meant sky. The sky at midday, dominated by the scattering that selects shorter wavelengths and sends them toward the eye from every direction. The sky at dawn, where the light source is still low and the atmosphere scatters the blue wavelengths across a wide field. The sky at dusk, when the same scattering produces the last blue dominant light before the transition to darkness. The cells that evolved to read this light evolved in the period before any source other than the sky, and the sun produced blue-green photons in quantities sufficient to activate them. In the long period before screens, the only blue-green light available at midnight was starlight, too faint at ordinary star densities to meaningfully activate the reporting cells. Moonlight at full moon is bright enough to influence the clock's chemistry, but not the same wavelength composition as sky. Firelight is warm, red-shifted, not the range the reporting cells prioritize. The candle, the oil lamp, the fire, none of these produce the blue-green output that the cells are built to read. The reporting cells, across almost the entire history of the eye, received their significant signals from the sky. They are calibrated to read sky. At midnight, they are reading the screen. The retina contains cells built to see. It also contains cells built to report. The first group makes the image. the edge of the screen, the shape of the hand, the pale surface of the ceiling receiving the screen's scattered light. Their output reaches the part of the brain that assembles the visible world. The second group does not make the image. It does not care what the screen is showing. It does not register the text or the image or the interface element at the center of the frame. It responds to one thing: the sustained presence of blue-green light, the wavelength range that, in the world outside screens, corresponds to sky, to open sky at midday, to the quality of light that marks the transition from night to day. The report goes inward, not to the visual cortex, not to the region that assembles the seen world, to the small clock in the brain that keeps the body aligned with day and night. The clock does not see the screen. It does not read the text on it. It does not know the hour displayed in the corner of the interface. It receives the report. Light is present. The clock adjusts. What it adjusts is not a number. It adjusts the phase, the position in the daily cycle. The body should be in the dark hour state. The clock has received a report that says light is present. It moves the phase toward day. It sends a signal to the structure that produces the chemistry of darkness. The chemistry of darkness is reduced. The clock runs this adjustment without consulting any other part of the brain. The decision, if it can be called a decision, is made entirely at the level of the cells that receive the report and the structure that processes it. The part of the brain that knows it is midnight, that knows the overhead light is off, that knows the screen is a screen and not the sky. That part receives no input here. The clock does not receive the context. It receives the photons through the cells that report them. The cells are calibrated for one question: blue-green light present or absent? At midnight, with the screen on, the answer is present. At midnight, in the absence of a screen, the reporting cells would be quiet. The ambient illumination from the street, passing through curtains at low levels, is not in the right wavelength range or sufficient intensity to activate them significantly. The indicator lights in the room are red or green, not blue-green. The room at midnight, without the screen, is dark enough that the report going to the clock is night. The clock, receiving this report, maintains the chemistry appropriate to night. In the blood, melatonin is rising. The compound the clock uses to signal darkness to the rest of the body's biology. It does not produce sleep directly. It carries a signal, dark hours. Processes that require this signal, that are waiting for it, that run at their full rate only when it is present, begin running when it arrives and continue as the concentration climbs. By midnight, without a screen, the concentration is near its peak for the 24-hour cycle. It has been rising for several hours. It will remain elevated through the early hours of the morning. The body at midnight without a screen is in the chemistry the darkness produced. The processes that require this chemistry are running. The body has received the full signal that darkness carries from the reporting cells through the clock, through the structure that releases the compound into the blood. The chain is complete. The full night chemistry is present. The screen changes this. The reporting cells in the retina receive the blue-green photons the screen produces. They activate. The report changes. Light is present. The clock receives the updated report. the chemistry of darkness is reduced. The melatonin that was rising has been interrupted, not stopped, but lowered from the level it would have reached by this hour without the screen's contribution. The suppression begins within minutes of sustained exposure and continues for as long as the exposure continues. The clock does not ask whether the light is appropriate to midnight. It receives the report and adjusts accordingly. A brief flash of blue-green light would produce a small response. Sustained exposure produces a cumulative one. The screen has been on for the duration of the session, tens of minutes or hours. Each minute of sustained exposure has contributed to the total activation of the reporting cells. The integration is not a discrete event. It is continuous, accumulating at the rate the cells are activated, building across the duration of the session into the total signal the clock has been receiving. The screen did not need to fill the room with light. It only needed to reach the cells that report to the clock. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The chemistry that was running for the dark hours is running at reduced levels. Not absent, the suppression at this exposure level is partial, not complete. But the body at midnight, in this room, with this screen, is not fully in the dark hours. The clock has received the report of light. The signals that follow from that report are running. The biology that receives those signals is responding to what the signals say. The body is doing what a body does when the clock says light is present. Not fully, not with the full chemistry of day, not with the full alertness and metabolic engagement that daylight and waking produce, but not in the uninterrupted dark hour chemistry either. In the intermediate state, the intermediate state has a texture. The specific processes that require sustained darkness to run at their full rate are running at a reduced rate. The chemistry that would be present in the blood at this hour without a screen is not present at its full concentration. The body is not aware of this as a sensation. There is no signal that corresponds to insufficient dark hour chemistry. The body simply does what the current chemistry allows at the rate the current chemistry permits, which is a different rate from what the uninterrupted night would produce. The cells that report to the clock do not distinguish between the sun and the screen. They respond to the wavelength and the sustained level of illumination. The screen produces blue-green photons. The cells respond to blue-green photons. The report they send is the same report they would send to dawn. The evolutionary history that shaped them did not include screens. It included the sky at the transitions between darkness and day. The dawn sky, when blue-green wavelengths begin to dominate and the clock first receives the report that a new day has begun. The dusk sky, when those same wavelengths are last present before the report shifts back to darkness. The cells are calibrated to read this transition. They cannot read the calendar. They cannot read the hour on the device. A source that produces blue-green photons at midnight produces the same report that dawn produces, because the cells that make the report can only read the photons. The screen does not know this. It is producing the wavelengths required to render white and near white at a sufficient quality for the display's purpose. The blue-green component is not a feature aimed at the reporting cells. It is a consequence of the physics of producing the colors the image requires. The reporting cells are not the intended recipients of this output. They receive it because it is present, because they are in the path of the light, and because the wavelength falls within the range they were built to read. The screen is not trying to update the clock. The clock is being updated because the photons are there. The response is the same response. The clock update is the same clock update. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. In the brain, the clock is running at the phase the screen has contributed to. The chemistry in the blood is at the level the partial suppression has produced, lower than it would be without the screen's blue-green contribution, higher than daylight would produce, somewhere in the reduced range that an hour of screen exposure at midnight establishes. The photons that produce this are no longer traveling. They left the screen, crossed the short distance of the room, entered the eye, reached the layer of reporting cells at the back of the retina, activated them, and were absorbed. The cells sent their signal. The clock received it. The chemistry shifted. All of this happened before the next gesture changed the pattern on the screen. The response was running before the conscious brain registered what was on the screen. The screen is still producing blue-green photons. The reporting cells are still receiving them, still activated, still sending the same signal that says light is present, still integrating the cumulative exposure of the session into the report that runs continuously to the clock. The clock is still receiving the report. The chemistry is still running at the level the report requires. The room is dark. The body is in the position of sleep. The chemistry is not in the state that full darkness would produce. The gap between those two facts is the width of the photons that are traveling right now from the screen to the eye. The photons that are arriving at the reporting cells at this moment, that are producing the activation, that is producing the signal, that is maintaining the clock's current phase. The photons from the screen continue to travel the short distance from the surface to the eye. The clock continues to receive what they report. Breath enters. Breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains. Some minds do not fall asleep by being told to stop. They need something quiet enough to follow. The body is in the bed. It has been in the bed for some time, long enough that the contact surfaces between the body and the mattress have equalized in temperature, long enough that the breathing has settled from the pattern of movement and positioning into the slower pattern of a body that is no longer adjusting. The pillow has received the weight and warmth of the head. The bedding has settled around the body's current position. The lights are off. The room has reached the level of sound and light that it holds at this hour. The body is horizontal. The conditions for sleep are present. Sleep is not present yet, or it is present in some parts of the body and not in others. The question of whether the body is asleep is not a single question with a single answer. It is a question that different systems in the body answer differently at different times, because the transition from waking to sleep is not a switch that the whole body crosses together. It is a sequence, a set of gates, each with its own threshold, each closing at the rate its own biology requires. Some gates have already closed. The postural muscles have been releasing for some time. These are the muscles that hold the body upright during waking. The muscles of the neck that hold the head above the shoulders. The muscles along the spine that maintain the vertical. The muscles of the shoulders and the upper back that resist the pull of gravity on the arms. In waking, these muscles are not consciously controlled. They run at a low continuous level of contraction, just enough to maintain the posture the body is currently in, adjusting constantly to the small shifts of weight and balance that waking produces. This background activity is invisible during waking. It is simply the condition of a body that is holding itself upright and positioned. In the transition to sleep, this background activity decreases. The level of contraction in the postural muscles, the resting tone, falls as the nervous system begins its shift from waking to sleeping state. In a body that is lying down, the effect of this reduction is difficult to perceive directly. The postural muscles are no longer needed to hold the body upright. The mattress and the pillow are doing that. The reduction in tone is not producing a collapse, because there is nothing to collapse from, but it is occurring. The muscles releasing the small continuous contraction that waking required, the tissue becoming slightly more relaxed than it was an hour ago, the body settling more fully into the surface it is resting on. The neck muscles have already released. The muscles along the jaw have released. The masseter, which in waking can carry the tension of clenched or slightly held teeth, has let go. The muscles that hold the eyes in their position, the muscles that in waking produce the small constant corrections that keep the gaze steady, are no longer at their waking level of activity. The eyes have moved to the position of rest, which is not the position of directed attention. They are where gravity and the current state of the nervous system have placed them. The hands are warmer than they were an hour ago. This is not a common observation. Heat in the hands is not the sensation most people associate with the approach of sleep. The sensation most people associate is heaviness, or a kind of softening, or the loss of urgency. But the hands being warmer is a physical fact about what is happening in the body at this moment, and it is a fact that the body has produced without any instruction. The warming is the result of blood vessel dilation. In the transition to sleep, the blood vessels near the surface of the skin, the small vessels in the hands, the feet, the forearms, the lower legs, dilate. They open to a slightly larger diameter than they maintain during active waking. More blood flows through the surface tissue. More heat moves from the blood to the skin and from the skin to the air. The extremities, which in active waking are often slightly cooler than the core, because the body directs blood to where it is needed, and the hands and feet are not always the priority. become warmer as the blood distributes more evenly toward the periphery. This redistribution of blood toward the periphery is connected to the fall in core temperature that marks the approach of sleep. As the body enters the transition, the core temperature, the temperature of the deep tissues, the organs, the blood in the large vessels near the center, begins to fall. The fall is small in absolute terms, a fraction of a degree, the kind of change that would not register as feeling cooler. But it is a real change in the thermal state of the body, and it is produced by the same mechanism that warms the hands, the surface blood vessels opening, allowing heat from the core to move outward through the surface and escape into the air. The body is releasing its heat, not all of it, not at a rate that would produce discomfort. At the rate that the approach of sleep requires, which is a slow rate, a fraction of a degree over many minutes, the body cooling toward the temperature it holds during the deepest hours of sleep. The hands, in receiving more blood from the dilating vessels, are carrying this heat outward. They are the body's radiators at this hour, slightly warm to the touch, slightly warmer than they were, releasing into the air what the core is releasing into the blood. The warmth in the hands is the core cooling. The breathing has changed. In waking, breathing is variable. It responds to speech, to movement, to shifts in attention and posture, to the small demands that waking activity places on the respiratory system. The rhythm is present but irregular. The depth varies from breath to breath. The rate varies slightly. The pauses between breaths vary in length. The system that controls breathing is responsive, adjusting continuously to what the body currently requires. In the transition to sleep, the breathing becomes more regular. The irregularities that waking produces, the slight acceleration that a shift in attention can produce, the brief holds, the occasional deep breath that the body takes without prompting, the sigh, these become less frequent. The rate settles toward a consistent value. The depth settles toward a consistent depth. The pause between exhale and the next inhale becomes more uniform. The breathing becomes less a response to the changing demands of waking and more a steady exchange at the rate the resting body requires. The chest rises and falls at the rate sleep asks of it. The rhythm is not an instruction. No part of the sleeping body has decided on this rhythm. The respiratory system is running at the rate the current chemical state of the blood requires. The oxygen and carbon dioxide balance that the reduced activity of the transitioning body produces. And at that rate, the rhythm is regular. It is the regularity of a system that is no longer being interrupted. The heart has slowed, not dramatically, not to the rate of deep sleep, which will come later, but it has moved from the rate of a body that was recently active, recently aware, recently making the small adjustments that waking requires, toward the rate of a body that is releasing those requirements one by one. Each contraction of the cardiac muscle is still producing the same result, still moving the same volume of blood through the same circuit, still delivering oxygen to the same tissues at the rate they currently require. The circuit is unchanged. The rate at which the circuit runs has decreased by several beats per minute from what it was an hour ago. The body is doing less. Not all of it. The heart is still contracting. The lungs are still exchanging. The processes that run continuously regardless of the sleep state are still running, but the body has reduced the activity that waking requires and has not yet replaced it with the activity that deep sleep will require. It is in the interval between the two, the interval of slowing, the interval in which one set of requirements has been released before the next set has fully engaged. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The body did not enter sleep as one piece. Some gates closed before others. There is a moment that some bodies produce in this transition, a sudden small contraction, usually in the legs or the arms, sometimes in the whole body. A brief involuntary jerk, arriving without warning, sometimes strong enough to be perceived as a falling sensation, sometimes strong enough to partially reverse the transition and bring the body back to a lighter state, sometimes producing the image of a step that missed, a stumble, a drop, the visual fragment that the brain, briefly interrupted from its descent, produces to explain the jerk. This is the skeletal muscles releasing. The muscles of the limbs, the large muscles of the thighs and calves, the muscles of the upper arms and forearms, have been maintained at a low level of resting tone throughout the early part of the transition. As the nervous system moves deeper into the transition, the motor tone in these muscles falls toward the level the sleep state requires, which is substantially lower than the waking resting level. The fall in tone is not always smooth. Sometimes, as the motor system releases its hold, the transition produces a brief reflex contraction, a discharge from the system as it hands off the muscles from waking control to sleeping state. The jerk is the gate closing, not an error, not a symptom of something wrong with the transition, a structural feature of the passage, the motor system's last check before it completes the handover. After it, the muscles of the limbs are at the reduced tone of sleep. The motor pathway that connects intention to action is still present, but running at a level that does not produce the kind of response it produced in waking. The limbs are still there. The threshold has moved. The crossing happened in the jerk. The sounds in the room have changed, not the sounds themselves. The building carries what it has been carrying all evening. The street outside contributes what the street at this hour contributes. The small mechanical sounds of the room systems run at the same levels they have run all night. The sounds have not changed. The processing of the sounds has changed. In waking, sound arrives and is processed as event. A sound at a particular location. A sound with a particular quality. A sound that requires an assessment. What is it? Where is it? Is it relevant? Does it require a response? This processing runs continuously in waking, not consciously, not as deliberate attention, but as the baseline activity of a system that is continuously monitoring the environment and flagging what might matter. The processing has a cost. It requires the auditory cortex and the regions that evaluate relevance to remain active, ready to respond to whatever arrives. In waking, this readiness is maintained continuously because what arrives in the environment cannot be predicted and anything might matter. The system does not close between sounds. It remains open, running at low level, ready for the next arrival. In the transition to sleep, the threshold for this processing rises. The sounds that were being processed as events, arriving, being identified, being assessed for relevance, begin to arrive without completing the processing chain. The first stages of auditory processing continue. The sound waves reach the ear and are converted into neural signal at the level of the ear itself. But the later stages, the stages that produce the identification of the sound as a specific thing, the stages that ask whether it matters, begin to run less reliably. A sound arrives and is processed as far as the sensory level and does not complete the step that would make it an event. The room does not become quieter. The room becomes less legible. The sounds are present. The system that would read them as events has raised its threshold. What does not reach the threshold does not become an event. The refrigerator, the building, the street, present at the same levels they have been present all evening, now below the line at which the sleeping system responds. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. In the interval between waking and the first full sleep stage, some bodies produce imagery, fragments, not the constructed narrative of a dream, not the sustained, coherent world that sleep will eventually produce. Fragments of visual information that appear and dissolve without sequence, without context, without the cause and effect logic that waking perception maintains. A face, briefly present and then absent. A word on a surface, almost readable, gone before it can be read. A landscape element, a wall, a path, something that was near but has no space surrounding it. Sounds that arrive as if from a specific location, spoken or produced by something specific, dissolving before they can be placed. These are not memories being replayed. They are the visual and auditory processing systems running at reduced coherence. Not fully off, not at the level of organized dreaming, but at the level that the transition produces. The systems that build the seen world and the heard world are still outputting, but they are no longer receiving the organized input that waking provides, and are not yet receiving the internally organized input that sleep will produce. They are running on the residue of the day's processing, the traces left in the neural pathways by the events and images and sounds that have passed through them in the past hours, producing brief images as the activity drifts through the patterns that the day laid down. The fragments appear without being requested. They dissolve without being dismissed. Neither the appearing nor the dissolving is under the direction of anything that could be called a decision. The system is between states, and the between state produces these half-formed outputs, which are the evidence that the visual cortex is still running, but is no longer receiving instructions about what to build. The body that was in the bed an hour ago and the body that is in the bed now are in different states. The postural muscles are at lower tone. The hands are warmer. The heart is slower. The breath is more regular. The auditory threshold is higher. The sounds the room is producing are present, but are no longer being processed as events that require a response. The visual processing is producing fragments rather than the organized scene world of waking. The motor system has released its waking level hold on the muscles of the limbs. Each of these changes happened at a different point in the past hour. Each one crossed its threshold when the conditions at that threshold were met, when the temperature fell enough, when the neural signal shifted enough, when the accumulated change in the nervous system reached the level that particular gate required. The changes did not wait for each other. The hands warmed before the auditory threshold rose. The jaw released before the limbs jerked. The fragments appeared after the room became less legible, but before the first full stage of sleep was reached. The body did not arrive here as a whole. It arrived piece by piece, gate by gate, each part of the transition occurring when its conditions were satisfied and not before. The sequence producing what appears from outside as a single event, the body asleep, but what is, from inside the process, a series of separate crossings, each at its own rate, each at its own time. Some gates are still closing. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. When night falls, the archive remains.